My name's Elizabeth Foy. I'm the head of adult learning here, and it's my joy and my privilege to organise these events. I'm delighted to see you and delighted to see Megan Daffern, who's going to speak to us today about the Psalms. The Psalms, very dear to my own heart. They've been formative for me, and particularly formative in the idea that you can say anything to God. You can take any joy and any despair and any anger and any disheartenment, and you can tell God off, which has been very important for me spiritually. And so I was very delighted to see that Megan had written a book, because she brings together both the scholarly and the devotional in a way that I haven't encountered before about the Psalms. And I am anything but scholarly. I don't have a word of Hebrew, and some of you may be reading the book, as I have been for Lent, and really valuing it. And she has freshly translated the Psalms at the beginning of each chapter and then written some commentary. This is the book, which I commend to you very highly. Those of you might not be reading it at the moment, and a colleague will come from the shop at the end and have some copies for sale, which Megan will sign, should you wish her to. I must get my own copy signed. So Megan, Dr Daffern, is chaplain at Jesus College, Oxford, and teaches Old Testament there. And this is her first popular book. Yeah. Yes. And I was very delighted when she said yes, she would come. She'll speak for about 40 minutes. Then we'll have about 20 minutes of questions and answers. Or if nobody's got a question, I will ask questions for 20 minutes. So I tell you, gear up, because otherwise it's all my agenda. We'll finish sharply at 2. We'll have book sales after. Thanks for coming. I'm going to hand over to her now.
Thank you all very much for making me so welcome. It's a real privilege to be able to be with you today and to speak. I don't often get to London, so this is a one-off and a rare delight. Thank you very much. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about the story of the book and how it came to be. A couple of years ago, I thought, what shall I do this Lent? I thought, I will do some devotional writing. Now, that sometimes came in the form of letters to friends. I'm not always a very good correspondent, but I always do my best. And it might be in the context of a few thoughtful sermons. I wasn't beating myself up about it, because term time in Oxford is always extremely busy, and so I didn't want to make a rod for my own back. But I do enjoy writing. I reflect when I'm writing, and I thought this would be an excellent way of doing something devotional and a bit different for Lent. So my Lenten discipline was to write something every week. I wouldn't necessarily hold myself to something every day, because I knew that probably wouldn't happen. And some of what I wrote was engaging with the Psalms. Why the Psalms? Because I had written my doctoral thesis on them. But not only that. The Psalms are an integral part of my worship. I say morning and evening prayer almost every day, and we have college evensong every day, every Sunday during term time. And there are lots and lots of psalms in lots of different translations, therefore, interspersing my worship and my prayer life. I love the Psalms. So when I started doing my doctoral thesis, I came up with the idea that I was going to be thinking about memory in the language of prayer. I didn't necessarily decide I was going to do New Testament or Old Testament. I wanted initially to do it across the whole Bible, but supervisors being supervisors, they do make you narrow down. And so we quickly decided that the obvious corpus for thinking about prayer texts in the Bible was going to be the book of Psalms. And I was quite delighted by this, actually. So I then narrowed it down and became a Hebrew Bible or Old Testament scholar, and I loved it. So that's where I was coming from. So the Psalms are effectively second nature to me. So I spent a bit of time thinking about translating some psalms and just writing them in a way that might be accessible to Christian people in England. I wanted them to be able to connect with people. And so I thought carefully about how I might translate them, what I might want to say to other people about them. Anyway, we got to the end of Lent, and I thought, well, that was nice. I enjoyed that, and I didn't think too much more about it. However, my then bishop, Bishop John Pritchard, formerly Bishop of Oxford, who has a lot to do with SPCK, so I've got a lot to thank him for. I was in communication with him, and he was encouraging me to write something sort of popular. So after a while, I thought, well, I'll send off to him what I wrote through my Lenten writings and see what he thinks about my style and about, how I might go about something like this in the future. He wrote back a couple of days later and said, I've taken the liberty of sending it to the editorial team at SPCK, and a few months after that, I had a commission to write a psalm a day for Lent and Easter. So that's how it came about. 6 months later, it was with the SPCK team, and it was a real joy. I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. How did I go about it? If you have picked up a copy, then please bear with me while I might repeat some of what you already know. If you haven't, then this bit's for you. There's an overture, as it were, of the week that begins Ash Wednesday and goes through to the Saturday. And then there's the 4 weeks of Lent per se, each according to a particular theme, which I would hope would connect with everyday lived experiences in our day and age. Week 1, it's a hard world. Week 2, it's an unjust world. Week 3, it's a big world. And week 4, it's a beautiful world. It's a beautiful world begins with Mothering Sunday or Refreshment Sunday. And so that was a way of trying to echo the themes of that stage of Lent. Then we get to Passiontide. Passion Sunday is the Sunday of week 5 in Lent. I don't write psalms. I didn't include psalms on the Sundays because, as I'm sure you're all aware, Sundays don't count in Lent. Then Lent would be more than 40 days, and that would confuse us all mightily. So Sundays I give us all a break, which means that if you're anything like me and you're reading a Lent book and you've missed out a few days along the way, then in fact Sunday is often quite a good time for catching up. So Passiontide, I then changed the tone a little, thinking about journeying. So from place to place is week 5, and then Holy Week, week 6, to a holy place. Then we get to week 7, and that's Easter, a redeemed world, a complete change of the picture. So I had to choose different psalms that would suit each of those themes, but I didn't want to end up just doing a few similar psalms. I wanted to jump all around the 5 books of the Psalter in order to give you a good variety of different texts. If you are familiar with the Psalms, you'll know that there's a big variety in these prayers. There are all sorts of different types of prayer. There are lament prayers, there are wisdom prayers, Torah prayers, prayers that talk about the law. There are hymns, there are occasional ones which don't actually mention very much about God, like Psalm 45. It's a wonderfully eclectic set of texts, 150 psalms and 5 books within them, not divided equally, but little collections within them. There are prayers of thanksgiving, prayers of joy, and everything else in between. They cover the whole gamut of experience, emotion, and humanity. There's nothing left out, I might even go so far as to say. So what exactly is a psalm? You've already picked up, presumably, that there's something of the eclectic about this collection. There are prayers which are simply to God. There are words which are about God. There are words which may not even so much be about God, but about enemies or foreigners or brothers and sisters, and how we see our lives in relation to them. They are texts which can be used in worship, texts which always were used in worship, and texts which, as you've heard, still continue to be used in worship today. So I wanted to try and cut across all of those different categories in the way that I chose the Psalms. I translated each of them, and that in itself was fun. A bit more about that in a moment. And then I wrote a comment on each of them so that there would be 800 to 1,000 words, a nice bite-sized chunk of reflection after I'd finished the translation. It was usually the translation in the first place which gave me the starting point for things that I might want to talk about. So I've been described as exploring some of what I have learnt from studying, translating and praying these extraordinary songs of hope, challenge and wisdom. So at least you know that I'm keeping to my brief. That was precisely how I began my preparations today. What are they all expecting? What have they been told to expect? So that hopefully I may meet some of those expectations, even if not all of them. And that's why you have question time at the end. So what have I learnt from studying the Psalms? Prayer is clearly an ancient art, and it will go on throughout the ages and across the world. Some of the texts of the Psalms are very, very old indeed. It's hard to give precise dates, and a lot of them come from all different eras. Some seem to reflect an experience of exile, which would have been in the early 5th century BC, when there was an exile from Jerusalem. 586, 587 was the BC was the sort of true destruction of the temple and all those kinds of things. Some psalms which allude to that seem to be a bit easier to date. Some of them talk about the monarchy, and so that is obviously a reflection of an earlier time. Some are said to be by David himself, and of course that's going back really quite a long way. It could well have been that some were deeply influenced by neighbours, geographical neighbours, and so there seem to be some resonances with literature and prayer texts of the ancient Near East, and probably going back even before David. They would have been part of the prayer life, part of the spiritual language, as it were, of these communities. And then they make their way into consolidated texts and written texts. Prayer then is clearly a deeply ancient art, the art of writing sacred texts for use in worship and for use in talking to God. And it will go on throughout the ages and across the world, which is why we have them today. If you think how many hands or minds or voices the Psalms must have gone through to reach us today, it's absolutely mind-boggling. So we, when we're praying the Psalms, are joining a massive community of many, many people we would never even begin to imagine or to think about. So it's wonderful to be part of such an historical and future-looking community. They're also, of course, Jesus's prayers. And that is partly how it also ties in to being a Lent book. As an Old Testament scholar, we tend to try quite hard to avoid any kind of supersessionist take on the Psalms. That is to say, or indeed the whole Hebrew Bible, that is to say, to be able to recognize the value of these texts and scriptures for themselves and realize that seeing them through our Christian lenses today isn't necessarily the whole story of how we might approach these texts. So writing a Lent book and writing about these texts as the prayers of Jesus means that there's a creative tension about that. There's a tension between receiving the text in all its integrity as a text which Christ himself inherited, and then also receiving it as a text which Christ himself then prayed, and which Christians throughout the world have prayed ever since. It's amazing to think that Jesus himself prayed some of these psalms, and that's partly how I chose the psalms for Holy Week, because they were the psalms that would have been sung by devout Jews at the Passover, so rather fitting for that most holy of weeks in the lead up to Christ's crucifixion. What else have I learnt from these psalms? I've mentioned that they cover the whole gamut of emotions and experiences. Sometimes prayer can be hard. If we're in such a desperate place, we might find that we don't have anything left in us to pray with. And that's sometimes where having other people's texts can actually be a real boon. We don't have to think up the words ourselves. We can use other people's words and let them be our prayer. I find that deeply encouraging at many stages of my life. And so there's a sense of there being no hope. There is a sense of there being hope even when there is no hope. Most of the Psalms, even if they're exploring some really deep, dark stuff, have a kind of turnaround, and they end in a much more positive note. There's one psalm, Psalm 88, which doesn't even have that. It's just depressing through and through, you might say. I sing Psalm 88 from the pulpit in my husband's church on Maundy Thursday during the stripping of the altars, just to a very simple plain song chant, and that is a real privilege to me and deeply moving, I think, for all of us. Even though there is no sense of hope in such a despairing psalm, yet the very existence of the psalm itself is a symbol of hope. The very fact that somebody could have called out to God in such a state, and not only that one somebody, but that it was then continued, it was passed down, suggests that even when there seems to be absolutely no hope, sometimes there can be hope even just in the existence of a prayer, which is so raw and vulnerable. So the Psalms are a book of hope as well. Studying the Psalms also really consolidated for me the idea that study and prayer are intertwined. I wrote most of this book, and indeed some of my doctoral thesis, while I was on retreat. I'm not saying that is necessarily the way to do retreat, but it is certainly sometimes one way to do retreat, particularly if, like me, you like to reflect through writing. Sometimes then going away into the midst of the countryside and sitting down with the text of the Psalms in front of an icon in a little prayer space actually is wonderful, absolutely wonderful and life-changing. And so it was in that context that I wrote quite a lot of my book. So in a sense, I don't claim the credit for it, but I say, as in the initials at the beginning, SDG, as Bach would have known, Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone be the glory. So my writing has been a prayer, and I hope it will always be a prayer. Study and prayer, I think, can go very closely together and can be a really fruitful way of doing each of them. Particularly, of course, if you're studying prayer texts. That makes the connection even more obvious. I've mentioned how the Psalms are a sort of communal text, that they're prayers for all generations, all countries. That study of prayer is itself also a communal act. If you think about how Jesus' own Jewish education would have been shaped, it would have been at the feet of rabbis, it would have been in community, it would have been teaching passed on from one to another. Not necessarily the university setting that you might think of these days, where students hole themselves up in their rooms with books and they don't necessarily see the light of day for many hours on end. Obviously at Jesus College we try not to let that be the case because it wouldn't be very healthy, but sometimes we might have that vision of people tucking themselves away in a hermit fashion in order to do their study. The study of the Bible, the study of the prayer texts of the Psalms is perhaps at its best a communal thing. So it's wonderful that I'm here to share that with you today. And it's also a learning experience for me. More of that at the end. So what have I learnt from translating the Psalms? We've talked a bit about what I've learnt from studying them. What have I learnt from translating them? If you go to the regular worship here or indeed sing in it, and I know that some of you do, then you will of course become very familiar with some of the poetry, the words, the nuances of particular translations, particularly probably Coverdale in the Book of Common Prayer. Or if you're a regular saying the Common Worship Daily Prayer, there's a lovely app which you can download on these electronic gadgets, which certainly the youth seem to be increasingly connected to. There are ways in which we can connect to a modern translation in the setting of the daily office. So we know lots of different translations. When I came to giving my own translation, I wanted to do something new, something hopefully sometimes a little arresting, as well as hopefully sometimes also comforting. The Holy Spirit both comforts and challenges, and therefore, insofar as the Psalms are prayer texts which we pray with and to the Holy Spirit, songs of the Spirit, seems appropriate, doesn't it? Then, of course, we are looking at texts which will probably do a bit of both challenging and comforting. I then wanted to try and connect with people in our day and age in a new way. So sometimes I use quite modern language. Psalm 96, and I don't think anyone's got to Psalm 96 yet, unless you're reading ahead, which would be very virtuous. Psalm 96, for instance, I've brought many a smile to my students' faces by telling them that I use the word dis. Partly because obviously I know that you don't get dis in Coverdale or probably any other translation of the Psalms. I haven't come across it. But also because it has some alliteration. The phrase I use it in is dissing the divinities of other nations. Dissing the divinities, of course, has that alliteration and also a kind of tone, a sound about it that's a bit hard and a bit sort of critical, which I think is actually an echo of the kind of tone that the psalmist might have been wanting to get at there. So sometimes it might seem a bit uncomfortable because it's not the beautiful traditional poetry of the BCP. That's probably the most extreme example I could give you. But sometimes, of course, I did want it to be just gorgeous. Now, I don't pretend to be a poet. I love poetry, but I'm not writing in metre. I'm not writing in rhyming couplets or anything like that. These aren't metrical versions of the Psalms that you could sing to well-known hymn tunes. I think there are quite a lot of them, and I'm not even going to try to add my text to those. But they are texts which I hope, they are translations which I hope pay very close attention to the Hebrew word order, so sometimes they can be particularly emphatic. I've part of the communal study that I've been enjoying with my readership is that I've been rather surprised by getting some, quite a lot of lovely notes, often from complete strangers. This is a whole new world to me, so thank you for being with me as I grow in this new world. Psalm 74 was one which had quite a lot of feedback, actually. Psalm 74 is one that probably can be dated to shortly after the destruction of the temple. I can't find it now. There we go. And in the second part of this psalm, there is a very clear, emphatic Hebrew word order. I'm going to read out just a little bit to you so that you see where I'm coming from. It's addressed to God. The first little bit is really desolate angst, re-envisioning the destruction of the temple. And then verse 12, there's that turning point that I told you about. Yet God is my king from of old. He works salvation throughout the land. Then he goes on to address God. You, by your might, split open the sea. You shattered the heads of the sea monsters in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan, and you gave him as food to the throng of wild beasts. You broke open spring and torrent. You dried up ever-flowing rivers. Yours is the day, yours also is the night. You fixed in space the moon and the sun. You set up the boundaries of the earth, summer and winter. You created them. Remember this. The enemy has scorned you, Lord, and foolish people have spurned your name. So there's quite a climactic building up there of the emphasis on quite how much God has done for his people and the relationship he has historically had with his people. The rationale then behind it is saying, so how can you have let this happen? What are you going to do about it, God? That's echoing the Hebrew, there's a separate word for you, and then you is also included within the word that is the Hebrew verb. The way that Hebrew verbs are constructed means that lots of stuff, lots of meaning is squished into just a few letters. And that means sometimes the person who's doing the action and the person to whom, or the thing to whom the action is done, they can all be included within that word. So you have done so and so is two words. There's the you, and then there's the you have done so and so. I obviously wanted to pay due attention to that. Having read that, it also brings out something of the structure of the lines. Often Hebrew poetry is split into, each verse of Hebrew poetry is split into two halves, as it were, occasionally three. And there is a sense of metre and rhythm that comes out simply through that. So although I said I didn't do metre and rhythm, I let the Hebrew and the translation do the metre and the rhythm for me. All this idea of living translation, these texts, I am reminded, are ready to speak afresh to our generation and to each one of us and all of our contexts. Therefore, I might use some modern language, and I might use some simple language to try and help people to see them afresh, and not just to think, oh, that's one of those posh words that they use when the choir is singing the psalms. Ascribe unto God, for instance. We don't use the word ascribe in everyday conversation. Well, you may do, but I don't tend to. But I might talk about credit. I've got a credit card, and so I might want to say, I want to give credit to God, and that's precisely, therefore, how in fact I translate ascribe, because in fact that's actually very close to the original Hebrew meaning, at least in my interpretation. So these texts are, yes, they've been created, but they continue to be creative. They are living, organic texts. The Hebrew language has its own richness as well as its own simplicity. Our language has richness and simplicity in equal measure as well. And that can be a real gift to our life of prayer. In fact, it's rather fitting, isn't it, insofar as God in Jesus, at the prologue to St. John's Gospel, is considered as the logos, the word, the spoken word. So that's a little bit about what I've learnt from translating them. What I have learnt from praying them is the next thing on my brief. Of course, it's easier to think of them sometimes as our prayers, even if we're not in the place to pray and we want to use someone else's words and make them our own. But equally, sometimes they can be other people's prayers that we can pray for them, mindful of the fact that just as we sometimes might find ourselves finding it hard to pray, probably there are lots of other people out there right now who are having problems praying. And therefore, in fact, insofar as we might be praying these psalms, they can be prayers for them as well. If, for instance, we're in a really good place, we're having a honeymoon period in a new job, or we've just fallen in love with the love of our lives, if something is going really well for us, and in fact we want to sing lots of praise songs, and then the lectionary throws up for us an evensong, a real where was me psalm, then we might not sort of think this is deeply resonating with my soul at the moment, but it's probably deeply resonating with someone else's. There is, again, a sense of community in how we can pray. So sometimes they can be our prayers, sometimes they are prayers we pray for others. Others can help me in praying them, just as I can help them, just as I can pray them for other people as well. Reading and prayer as well can be intertwined. Prayer doesn't have to be something that we say aloud or just be silent and contemplative about. Sometimes just by spending time with a text, reading it slowly, perhaps rereading it, it can be a way of praying in a different kind of language. The text, the written text, the ink on the page can be a kind of prayer in itself. They also give us phrases for our prayers. I don't know whether you've come across Jonah, the wonderfully short prophet, not short in stature, but short in words. And there are 4 chapters in the book of Jonah, so nice and easy for when you've got your next cup of tea. Jonah has, in chapter 2, suddenly breaks into a prayer. He's in the belly of the whale. He's in the deepest of the deep. He thinks that there is no future, and he bursts into prayer. How does he burst into prayer? Well, he doesn't just quote a psalm, but he quotes a mishmash of all sorts of different prayer and psalm texts from throughout the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And that, I think, is instructive. That shows how sometimes we can be shaped by the very language that we hear in the prayers that we pray or others pray with us. We may not be able to memorize those texts from beginning to end, but sometimes those phrases can stick with us. That, I think, is just what happened with Jonah, insofar as you consider Jonah to be an historical book. But that's another question, and I'm talking about the Psalms, not Jonah, so that's easy. I don't have to go into that now. But there is a sense in which we can pick up the language of prayer by immersing ourselves in the Psalms. I've said that I continue to learn. I continue to learn about the Psalms as I pray them afresh, day by day. And I continue to learn about the Psalms with people like you, with my readership, with my students. My wonderful students at Jesus have decided that they share my passion for the Psalms, which is the right thing for them to say. And therefore, when they come along to singing at evensong and they take their psalm out for the day, which usually the preacher has chosen, they've instigated something called Psalms Corner. And that's when they look carefully at the text and they think a bit about the text together. This gives me great joy, as you can perhaps imagine, that our students are engaging so closely with the biblical text prior to performing them. So you see how prayer, study, leading worship can all be intertwined. by praying the Psalms, we are also studying them and reading them. Ancient prayers and the wisdom that they encompass can build us and indeed our communities up. We are communities of prayer. We are communities of faithful people. And then a little coda, as it were. These are extraordinary songs of hope, challenge, and wisdom, as was also said in the blurb about me. Well, absolutely. I've already mentioned the extraordinary gamut of experience and emotion that go into these psalms. I've mentioned Psalm 88 and its despairing tone throughout. There are other psalms where there's a great deal of despair, and as I say, there's a sudden turnaround in emotion and tone. So there can be hope even in the darkest moments. Psalm 22, for instance, which is then quoted by Jesus on the cross in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. You see how Jesus himself used the Psalms? How encouraging is that? Psalm 22 itself even has words of hope there, even when we associate them from a Christian tradition with the foot of the cross. And challenge. I know sometimes the Psalms fit uncomfortably with different people. Different Psalms are sometimes difficult to swallow. Psalm 137 is one of those ones that many churches might wish to take out the last couple of verses, because there's a really ghastly image of smashing children's heads against rocks. Far from beautiful, not attractive, not the sort of thing we want to be proclaiming in our churches. But we still have them. They're still there. They haven't been edited out. Sometimes they might have square brackets around them in different traditions when they've come up with their own translations, but I haven't shied away from them because they are part of the whole text. As I say, it's about a whole gamut of experience and emotion. And Jesus himself didn't take a sabbatical to edit the Psalter. He prayed them as they were. He received them as they were, and he didn't stop them being passed on as they are. Indeed, he says, not one jot or tittle will pass away from the law, the Torah, and it seems that he might have had the same take on the whole of Scripture. These are scriptures which shape a community identity, however unpalatable they may seem, and they remind us, even those most gory and unpleasant of verses, that in fact God invites us to give everything to him. Our moments of anxiety and profound sadness, our moments of the most vicious anger, as well as our moments of sweetness and light. And they're psalms of wisdom. Some psalms, like 119, are indeed designed, it would seem, as wisdom psalms. They're like an ABC. They are written, each verse starting with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. You don't always get that in the BCP, in other translations. You don't always have that brought out because that would be quite difficult to do in a different language. But if we know that that's how they're written, that tells us something about some psalms that might seem to have been put together as kind of textbook psalms, psalms that are deeply about the law or about wisdom, psalms that want people to learn as well as to be able to pray. And learning and prayer, of course, as we've thought about, go rather closely together in the world of psalms. Learning and humility were part of my overture, as it were, to the first week of Lent. We don't necessarily always remember every sermon we've heard, but one sermon I do once remember in my first college chapel was that to learn requires humility and to teach requires patience. That learning requires humility is deep, and it helps us to realise that we've still got stuff to learn. Helps us to be open to what we might learn from others, or from texts, or from experiences. You've heard me say that this is a learning process for me as it is for you, and therefore I'm hoping that I might too learn from some of your questions and feedback and engaging with me about the wonderful texts of the Psalms and the way in which I have sought to draw them together for devotional Lent reading. And just to end with a little finale, if you haven't begun yet, it's not too late. Thank you very much.
I think I'm going to hog the first question anyway, sorry about this. There are some dangerous emotions, as you've said in this. Do you think there are dangers about taking those emotions in? Do you think the Psalms can be dangerous? That's what I want to ask you.
That's a very... I think maybe, yes, they can be dangerous if you take them out of the context of prayer. If they are in context of relationship with God, and we believe God is love, then insofar as we are embraced and held and surrounded by love, then I would want to suggest that even those kinds of dangerous emotions can be transformed. They can be held safely, shared safely with God, rather than bursting out in dangerous ways to other people when we might cause hate or hurt or suffering.
Thank you.
Does that satisfy?
Yes. Best place to go with them. Best place to go with
absolutely. Yeah. So if you're going to have any dangerous stuff in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and there is some, then the best place to have it will be in the prayer texts.
Thank you. So, what have we got? What's stirring in the room? Who's got a question? What bothered you? What didn't you understand? Oh, Hilary. Hilary goes with bothered.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that, and I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the point you made, as glad you made it, about the fact that in our lectionary, the set readings that we have for each day of the Sundays, sometimes they do miss out the nasty bits.
Yeah.
The difficult bits. And I think I heard you saying that really we should keep them in. Is that right?
I think that there's a time and...
Say a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. You put me in mind of a moment when we had Psalm 137 in our chapel. A preacher had requested it and he hadn't specified any excision. So the choir sang the whole of it, which meant that they really, this was prior to Psalms Corner even coming about, actually, this was years ago, but they really engaged with this, and they were sort of saying, but how can this be part of our worship? How can this be part of the music that we're singing? How can this be part of a sacred text? And so it immediately got them asking questions. It got their attention more than any other psalm they had sung to date. And it's good to engage with a text, and it's good to draw young people to engage with a text. However, there was a senior member in the chapel who retired gentleman who himself works with texts and a very devout, lovely man. And he was clearly distraught by the inclusion of these verses. Pastoral nightmare, radar going berserk. And he had the grace to stay for the entire service, but then on the door he made his feelings known to me in no uncertain terms. I suggested, as is the way of all Oxbridge chaplains, that we should discuss this over a glass of sherry. Resonates. And I discussed with him some of the importance of the integrity of the text, the importance of engaging with the painful, the importance of being able to commit it to God, because those lines are actually committing that kind of deep, vicious emotion to God. It might be that in different congregations, different contexts, it is considered pastorally wiser to take them out. In a learning community, which was in a relatively good place, I felt that it was actually safe to keep them in. And it had the benefit, as I say, of provoking lots of questions, lots of thought about worship in general and not just about those 2 verses, and lots of thought about what we do with the Bible and how we engage with those really difficult bits. So it was actually really quite constructive, even those very destructive lines.
Thank you. Who's got something? Oh, lady over in the corner, and I'll come back to you.
Please.
Psalm of spirit.
Yeah.
Obviously, when you were talking about it, the variety of songs, some very happy ones, some
Yeah.
very dark,
Yeah.
some very horrific. But taking the whole 150 of them, what emerges? Is it overall very dark, overall very happy, or is it a very mixed, a rainbow?
Thank you. Yes, the question was about how mixed all the Psalter is, whether there's an overarching tone of joy or sadness. I think the answer is that it is indisputably mixed. There's no one way of saying, oh yes, actually most of the Psalms are jolly, or most of the Psalms are just beautiful, or most of the Psalms are full of angst. I think they are extremely broad. And there's sadness in the midst of joy, and there's joy in the midst of sadness. And that, to me, seems like an amazing echo of the human condition. The kind of silver lining to every grey cloud, as it were. The Psalter, you could say, is a silver lining to a grey cloud in every circumstance, or a beautiful clear blue sky at the same time. But probably not then, Psalm 137.
Sure. I can ask this gentleman now.
You spoke of hope, challenge and wisdom. I guess you could hope, sure of course you know you can translate them meaningfully. And there's wisdom there to be conveyed in your notes of the Psalms. But it seems to me that possibly a challenge you faced is how to select from 150 Psalms. You've scooted over that and haven't said you just
Thank you.
pulled the Psalms out of the
Yeah.
So how did you do it? What were the criteria? And what was the process?
So sometimes there are collections of Psalms. So as long as I had sort of 1 or 2 from those collections, then I felt that that particular collection was represented. I wanted to make sure that each kind of Psalm, each tone of Psalm was represented. Each kind of date of Psalm, as it were, insofar as we can work that out, was represented. And therefore there's not very much repetition, certainly. So I've tried to take something that's representative across the board.
The rainbow, as the lady.
Yeah, the rainbow, absolutely.
How many Psalms have you commented on?
47.
Oh, it's quite a good book.
It is. A few of them.
Yes, okay.
Psalm 119, which is the massively long one. Obviously, I didn't do it all because that SPCK might not have wanted to print that. But anyway, and it would have taken a lot of translating. 176 verses of it. Can you imagine? So sometimes I do select within the Psalms, but usually I translate the whole of those Psalms. So that also, of course, did come into the selection a little as well. I didn't want to give you hefty, long Psalms every single day because I didn't want to wear you out. So I've tried to be thoughtful as well. Pastoral.
That's a logical way. I mean, I must admit, I thought probably there'd be less, but you've got about a third. So from that, you get a good representation.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say, sorry, you asked about how many Psalms are translated. 47. That does mean it's a Psalm a day for Lent and Easter, but on Good Friday, I have a little cheeky way of turning that round. I actually have 2 on Good Friday because they come at the end of the sequence for the a great Hallel. And so one of them is very short, 117, and one is rather longer, 118. And that leaves us then with a gap on Holy Saturday. Holy Saturday, when Jesus was in the tomb, I wanted to encourage a sense of nothingness, a sense of total rest. So rather than doing a psalm, I took one Hebrew word which I had left untranslated in previous psalms, which I had hoped might by that stage have raised some questions. People might have started thinking, what is this Selah that comes at the end of some of the verses? And then I take the word Selah on Holy Saturday, because that could be something to do with rest, it could be something to do with an instrumental interlude, it could be something to do with the refrain, something, a pause to help things go in, as it were.
Yes, I was interested in the way you said that you weren't trying to write poetry because you weren't investing your translation in metre and rhyme. But of course, I'm sure you know poetry is much more than that in the way you said that some alliteration. For example, the psalm with the dis in it.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if that sense of musicality of language and the sort of patterning of language sort of appeared to you when you were writing, how significant it felt.
Thank you for that. So the question about how the musicality of the language sort of came through when I was translating the Psalms. Sometimes quite often in Hebrew poetry, a verse is sort of split up into phrases, as it were, we might think, speaking musically, phrases within a sort of overarching section of music. And so insofar as I was translating those phrases as phrases, of course, that then brought in a particular kind of rhythm and pace. I was also sort of wanting to think about the pauses, the sort of rests, as it were, in between the phrases. So I think that was another way in which the musicality of the language comes through. And the repetition, as I mentioned as well, and the repetition which kind of makes you go back and do it again, sort of thing, a sort of staccato or a tenuto sort of note, for instance, followed by the same again. So I was trying to think about phrasing, and I was trying to think about patterning. I wasn't, as I said, I wasn't being sort of angsty about precise rhythm, but I was trying to let the Hebrew effectively give me that. And so I wasn't necessarily doing it intentionally, other than letting the Hebrew create it. And actually that was really rather fun. And likewise on the poetic language, the visions of saplings, well-rooted beside a life-giving stream. Sometimes that kind of poetic image is that's one of the important things about poetry. And I wanted that to look beautiful and to sound beautiful in English, to be an attractive little image. And so I wanted to take those seriously as well.
Anybody? Oh, yes, lady there.
When you're using the Psalms for sort of individual or even group mindfulness or worship, how important do you think it is to take into account the individual circumstances of the person who wrote it? This is not just a piece of prayer, but this is an individual reacting to their immediate circumstances.
The question is about how important it is to take the author's perspective, viewpoint, voice into account. That's a really good question. Thank you for that. I think it's quite hard in many psalms to be able to pinpoint who the author was, or who the author was of some bits of it, because some verses may have been added onto the end. Some bits might have been tweaked by editors, so it's quite hard to uncover the, as it were, original voice often. And sometimes it's not just an I voice, but a we voice. And sometimes there's even change between those within a psalm. So Psalm 25, for instance, is I throughout, but then we in the final verse. So some psalms are individual psalms and some psalms are communal psalms. And it's often quite hard actually to pinpoint what that might be. So I wouldn't worry too much about that in a sense. I would want to look at the heritage of the psalm, possibly, more than trying to work out authorial intention, because I think trying to work out the authorial voice will often be quite a hard one. And I think we are invited by the Psalms as the collection that we now have them, by that very existence of the collection. We're invited to make them our own and to let them be other people's as well. And so I think maybe that goes back to the idea of community that I was talking about earlier. Does that? Thank you.
Last question? Anybody got a last question? Oh, yes, lady over there. Well, I can come back to you as well, but it's over there.
I just want to ask a couple of questions about the translation. Was it very easy to look just at the text and not have all the familiar translations sort of playing out in your head? Because I imagine that must be quite difficult, really.
Thank you.
Was there a particular part of the psalm that was particularly difficult to translate, and why was that?
Thank you. So a question about translating the Psalms and how much I was informed by my own language of prayer through hearing them in different translations, and then difficult moments. Sometimes, yes, I did have, the redolent poetry of Coverdale in my mind. So, for instance, the ascribe word that I was mentioning. But in a sense that actually then helped me to try and move away from that, to sort of think, oh, this is how, Coverdale might have put it, this is how common worship has it, but I want to do something different. So it was a kind of bouncing off area. The way I did approach the translations as well to try and keep myself fresh was that I had the Hebrew alongside the Greek Septuagint translation, alongside the Latin Vulgate, alongside the Jewish translation into English, alongside the NRSV, because that's a sort of staple, alongside the NIV, which is the Bible that we have in our chapel. So then I could also compare how other people had done it and what nuance they might have pulled out. Your question about difficulty, that's an interesting one, because yes, there were some. Hebrew poetry is actually quite hard often to translate, and some psalms are harder than others, but I couldn't immediately recall for you what some of those kind of hard moments were, but they did pop up quite a lot of the time. In fact, if I got to an easy psalm, I was more surprised by that, by the way in which it flowed through the translation, more than getting stuck on, well, how do I do this? How do I make sense of this particular grammatical thing? What's supposed to be going on here? So, yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes. If somebody, did you have a last question? I'm not going to put you on the spot. Was that you? Yes.
It's just really that it seems to be some, certainly when I was much younger, people rejected them for all the things and said, old-fashioned, we don't live in that kind of world, blah, blah, blah. But I'm gathering that people are going back now to the treasure trove about being authentic and honest and inclusive of everything that's humanity.
Yeah.
Do you think that's part of a much wider growth in the way we're looking at texts and teachings from the past, particularly the Old Testament?
Yeah. Wouldn't that be good? That's always my dream. I do love it when I meet a student who loves the Old Testament and doesn't need persuading to love the Old Testament. And there are a few of them around, but probably not a majority at the moment. But maybe this is a sea change. And maybe this is a moment where, in fact, we can actually say, Old Testament, love it. Tricky, difficult, sometimes a bit tedious, but we love it.
Really positive way forward for you.
It certainly is for me, yeah. And wouldn't it be nice if we could share that?
That's a marvellous end moment. Thank you, Megan. I can see my colleague Angela has come, and so is going to come and set up a stall of this marvellous book, which I commend you with all my heart. I've been following up my own Lent book on holiday, and yet still falling behind some days. Be encouraged. And she's going to come forward, and Megan will sign. But let's thank her.